Hello and welcome to CherrySTEM number nothing to CherrySTEM MINDBEND. You guys are right here. Yeah, all right. Microphone change. Awesome. I knew that. I remember that. All right, so welcome. Today we're going to talk about some awesome stuff. So it shouldn't be any different than the other day. But for a moment, let me direct your attention to the screen for those of you who are watching this live. For those of you who are not, I am showing a patreon.com/AnnaCherry snapshot, and I would recommend you all check out the Challenger mode to join us for after shows and other CherrySTEM related patron perks. You also, in case you don't want to expose yourself to too much lewdness and nudeness, that is the perfect tier for you because things get hardcore after the hardcore level. So this podcast, stream, live show, future podcast is brought to you by listeners such as yourself and patrons. Thank you, patrons. You guys are awesome. I appreciate y'all.
You guys rock.
You do. Come, let's grow our Patreon family. So if you can support us without hardship, $7 a month, Challenger mode, bing, bang, boom, you're in. Get to do live shows. Today, we're going to be listening to a dialogue or a lecture, if you will, snippets of lectures anyway, but I call it a dialogue because the first half is Terence McKenna and the second half is Jordan Peterson, and they talk about meaning. And in fact, I ran into a book that opens with Jordan Peterson's a treatise on meaning, and it's actually quite a large PDF that I will be including in the Patreon post, which are available for the public. This is a public service. Our patrons are amazing, and they allow us to provide this to all of you free of charge, etc. And you can go check out, once again, patreon.com/AnnaCherry. Bookmark it. Follow it. You do not have to be a patron if you cannot handle that at the moment. However, you still get to have the benefits that our awesome community throws your way, which is these audio files of our talks, as well as all the supplementary resources that I put there. And Jordan Peterson's, I believe it is called Three Forms of Meaning and the Management of Complexity. And in fact, that is what this talk is about. The special patron show video that I'll be sharing is talking about complexity and meaning, and it's going to be a natural conclusion of our talk today, and it'll be available for patrons only, so become one before the end of the show and you'll get your very own access as well. We've also started recording these
Achieve oneness before the end of the show.
Exactly. We've also started recording some of these patron after show talks, and they are available for patrons only on Patreon. So there are some exclusive goodies. If you are a patron and you want to have exclusive access, you still get that, but we also get to have our public access for everybody else because we're a public service. So this concludes your public service announcement. Thank you again to our patrons, and hopefully we can have a really interesting talk today. We're gonna have a little bit of everything, so let's transition into our conversation. Looks like the topic today is psychology of self and meaning, and with something that we touched upon in our Elephant in the Brain show, which was a couple of weeks ago, last month or so. We talked about the fact that there are reasons that we tell ourselves why we do things that are not exactly the accurate true reasons, and there's some compelling, interesting neuroscience to back up the fact that your brain or your consciousness sort of makes up a reason why you did something that other forces inside you forced you or pushed you to do, and then your sort of executive function, your consciousness, the alive part of you.
It's not making this decision as much as it's making up a reason for why it happened.
Exactly, and so we got some neat neuroscience for that, and then of course we're going to try to talk a little bit about consciousness, meaning, complexity, all of that stuff. Now the book I believe that Jordan Peterson was in is called The Psychology of Meaning, and it was published in 2013. So that's exactly what I was looking for. I was like, I'm pretty sure this got published before Jordan Peterson gave himself a name that would make him unpublishable in such books as The Psychology of Meaning, that has a list of PhDs and other academics who talk about this sort of thing. But yeah, so let's start, I guess, from the beginning, wherever that is. So, all right, making a decision using conscious versus unconscious thinking to solve problems. And then, of course, we have some neat PubMed studies too that talk about essentially the abstract says that there has been a long controversy as to whether subjectively free decisions are determined by brain activity ahead of time. We found that the outcome of a decision can be encoded in brain activity of prefrontal and parietal cortex up to 10 seconds before it enters awareness. This delay presumably reflects the operation of a network of high-level control areas that begin to prepare an upcoming decision long before it enters awareness. So simple, straight to the point, there's 10 whole seconds. That's a long time. 10 seconds is a really long time if you think about it in terms of brain activity and otherwise. You think you're like, oh, I need to move my hand to get the coffee cup, but that decision, that desire to do that, and the
can be as much as 10 seconds.
Yeah, before you decided you wanted that cup.
Right.
So I mean, put that in your pipe and smoke it. Like, what's that all about?
What's that all about?
Seriously though, what is that all about?
Well, I think it's because of the fact that there's a wide variety of brain activities that make up thought processes, and so the convergence of those processes from all the different things that are making up you. When you think about all the memories, all the experiences, all of those things that are combining together to make up a decision-making process. Of course, there's going to be a lot of processing going on beforehand that is leading in a certain kind of trajectory towards a given point. And I mean, even that's one of the things that where a lot of people, I forget what it's called, when they talk about how thought is very dependent upon language, and how it's something that people who have I've noticed that I don't think there's much difference between a lot of the Germanic languages and in the way that they have a trajectory of thought about that. But when you compare like I've noticed the way the Japanese compared to English, or Russian compared to English, what little experience I've had in those, the etymology gives you a connection between concepts that is very different. And so
in Russian in particular, as a fluent native Russian speaker, Russian, I believe that my language actually gave me the love of etymology that I have, because I'm obsessed with etymology. I love it. And the reason for that is because the way the Russian language works is you have a root, and then you have a suffix and a prefix, and the prefixes are set, the suffixes are set, and each one of them means something. It means towards, away from, under, over, and then the root itself is consistent. It's why it's called a root. It's consistent within the words that are related to that, and through that you end up finding connections between words that, especially now that I've been speaking English for so long and then going back to Russian, it removes that latent inhibition that I was used to these words being how they are, and now I can look at them as like, oh, this word is actually related to that word. Like the word pravda for truth is related to the word prava, which is the right, like your right hand, and also a right to have something.
But that's like exactly the opposite of what I'm talking about.
Well,
that is a weird exception.
Okay, sure.
The fact that right and
yeah, no, I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about the truth and rightness are associated with themselves. In Russia, it's the same root for both truth and being right.
I know, but that's a very arbitrary connection. It's funny. I mean, we were talking about that yesterday, but it's that's a very, very exceptional circumstance where there's no particular reason why there is an association, whereas most of the time the associations between words and their roots give a connection or hierarchy or association between topics and ideas that is kind of preloaded with your learning of language. And there's a
that seems to be perfectly related though, because like truth and being like, if you are right about something, that means you're speaking the truth, because truth pravda, prava. It's like it's in the
Right.
root of it all. So it's not arbitrary. It's. I
Oh,
think.
wait a minute. Maybe we're talking about two different things.
Yeah,
I
maybe.
didn't understand you because I was talking about how the direction, right versus left, of right, and having a.
No, sorry, but being right as like being accurate, being
Oh,
correct
okay.
about
Well,
something.
because we were just yesterday. All right, then that's my fault. Because we also were talking about how there's this weird connection between,
Different
the
languages.
direction right versus a legislation of a right. It's like what rights you have, and the fact that those two words are the same word in both English. And in Russian, it's the same word. Also, it's just
Yeah,
a
no.
weird thing. 'Cause
It
there's
is a weird
no
coincidence.
apparent reason for
Right.
them to be associated unless there is a common link between
No, but the
Russian language.
but in
and-
Russian, let's just let's explore pravda. So pravda is truth, which is also related to rule, pravila. So like rules on how to behave,
Okay.
and also related to how to be to be right, as in like you're accurate about something, and so it's.
Yeah, my expectation was in totally the wrong direction.
Well, I mean, it's I couldn't think of a different example fast enough, and so we were just talking about it. So it is my bad for adding something that was we just talked about last night in a
It's great. I
completely
think it's
different
great.
context.
I think it's great because we're talking about the trajectory of thought. That's where your expectations, when you interpret what somebody means, you have all these expectations that you're using as shorthand to, because we talk whenever we're having a conversation, we're relying on all this context for a person to interpret what we're saying, and whenever we're interpreting what somebody is saying, we use all of these so many different ideas of why they may be saying what they're saying to be able to extrapolate information that isn't actually present in the speech.
Right. So if you can't find it in the word,
like, for
then...
instance, I was using last night's context. It went, and that was incorrect, and that happens all the time. People use the wrong context, misinterpret each other, and there's people who believe that it's like, well, I'm saying very precisely what I mean. It's like, no, you don't understand. Language itself requires all of this, reliance upon shared meanings and shared experiences, and so when we're talking about like a trajectory of thought being like all of these various things adding together to make up a general direction, and if you have multiple things that are all headed kind of in the same direction, there is a convergence that it comes to. And so this is basically a very mechanical version of us that people really dislike. They hate the idea of human beings being and our thoughts being in any way mechanical or not utterly under our control. But the more you actually get into the science of things, you can't really hold that magical belief that we're that everything going on inside our mind is this magical thing disconnected from the function of the brain.
And even a more uncomfortable thing, other than aside rather from that, is the fact that as we were talking about during the summer spotlight for the elephant in the brain, is that human beings are primates, and primates are political animals, and so our brains are designed not just to hunt and gather, but also to help us get ahead socially, often through deception or self-deception. But while we may be self-interested schemers, we also benefit by pretending otherwise. The less we know about our own ugly motives, the better, and thus we don't like to talk or even think about the extent of our selfishness. That is the elephant in the brain.
Yeah.
So hence why we're talking about decisions being made 10 seconds before you actually make them. There is, and then your brain, the conscious part of your brain is like, I made that decision because of X. And what is that? Why is it telling you that story? Why is that story important? Why,
and why is that story so often wrong? And if you've really actually spent some time questioning yourself and not having just absolute certainty in all of your own thoughts and all of your own motivations and all your own, if you've ever had any real humility basically in your life and about yourself, then you recognize that people lie to themselves first, and so why do we do that? A lot of the time is because there's a natural automatic process to basically it's like drinking. It's like getting drunk. When somebody does something bad when they're drunk, if it's just kind of rude or whatever like that, we tend to sort of like, oh well, they're drunk, it's not really their fault. And the truth of the matter is, the upstream they decided to get drunk, so with their decision, if they had hit a child because they decided to drive because they got too drunk to make the decision to not drive, and they ran over a child, yeah, they had no intention of killing a child, but they did have the negligence of controlling themselves. And the same thing is true of consciousness. Whenever you are, we kind of tend to want to not notice what's going on in our own heads so that we don't have to feel like it's our fault when we do shady shit. You know, there is a level of throwing away personal responsibility in not being, you know, not doubting ourselves, not questioning ourselves, not looking for our own motivations.
Yeah. And so that's my goal and hope in bringing up this research, is to point out and to extrapolate how it is that we maybe through being able to see that there are decisions being made for you by the rest of your brain, which is, in my opinion and expertise, is everything, all the experiences that have happened to you, all the lessons that you've learned. They taught you how to be, and what is valuable, and what story to tell about who you are. And then we also have, you know, primal, instinctual, and political and self-delusional drives. And so there's this interesting dance between, you know, what our instincts want and push us to do, and then the stories we tell ourselves as to why we did it. And so if we want to go a little bit more into depth about the specific article or the studies of the 10 seconds, because, you know, it's a pretty bold claim. So I can certainly talk about how,
let's talk about the
how
details
it was done.
of that.
Yeah, so
The methods.
yeah, so the brain makes up its mind about 10 seconds before
And
you
there's
realize
more
it.
than one
Yes.
you know, study about this.
There it goes back to the 80s. Like,
right.
it's,
They've been doing this for a long time,
Yeah.
in a variety of ways.
It's just this specific one gave an exact sort of number, and so let's talk about that number. The 10 seconds before your brain rather, making up its mind. Your brain making up your mind 10 seconds before you realize it, according to researchers. Well, they're looking at brain activity while people were making decisions, and researchers could predict what choices people would make before they themselves had an idea. So that's compelling. The work calls into question the consciousness of our decisions, and may even challenge ideas about how free we are to make any choice at any particular time. So here's a quote from a neuroscientist at Max Planck Institute of Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig, Germany, who led the study. And he said, his name is John Dylan Haynes, and he said that we think our decisions are conscious, but these data shows that consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. The results are quite dramatic, said Frank Tong, a neuroscientist at Vanderbilt in Tennessee, the school that rejected me. 10 seconds is a lifetime in terms of brain activity. Yes,
yeah,
yes, it
so
is.
Huge. It's just a monstrous period of time.
10 seconds is a lifetime. Imagine yourself being in pain or in an awkward situation, or 10 seconds is a long time just
holding
the real
your
world.
hand in a fire for the count of 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and
we're only halfway through, folks.
No, it's a 10 seconds is a long freaking time.
And for neuronal activity, it is a lifetime. Like, things happen on a millisecond level inside brains in terms of brain activity. So 10 seconds.
One other thing I wanted to hit on real quick before we continue forward is just the idea of that the other thing that's really important is understanding how much of our ideas, our opinions, things like that are handed to us in childhood, and we never actually make any conscious decision to have certain beliefs and attitudes about things. Like, one of the things that was one of my favorite, I wouldn't call it favorite necessarily, but a good example of beliefs handed off to children, for instance, is like this commercial from Super Soaker, where this one kid has a little, you know, tiny, you know, not affluent squirt gun, where it's this smaller one, and all the other kids with their Super Soakers then surround that child and spray it, and it's obvious that this child has been surrounded. Literally has been cast out by the group. It is no, because of their not having the affluence to have the correct item that shows their affluence, and to be able to compete means that they are going to be rejected by all of society. And so there's
that's actually really, really fascinating you bring that up, because on one hand, obviously there's a term for it, I forget right now what it's called, but there's a way to it's advertisers targeting children in order for children to nag their parents to buy that particular item. But the fact that they're using social ostracization as the main driving force, and also there's a Disney commercial that is slightly less heavy-handed, but is a similar one to that. And this actually reminds me of something that I personally witnessed on the playground when we were doing an ingress farm. There's a lot of kids running around, and one of them was wearing a cross. And actually, there was a couple of kids, and I overheard one of them, mom saying to the kid, "Hey, wear your cross," or something about getting a cross or wearing a cross, and the kid didn't really want to. And then later, some other kid was like, "Look at my cross. I got a cross. It's so cool." And then that first child went to their parent and asked for a cross to be able to have one, whereas before they didn't want one. And it was entirely, essentially, something you would think that is too cynical or too adult for kids to be engaged in. Basically a social concern, feeling like you're going to be left out if you don't have the same items as, like, that's adult problems.
Yeah, no, it's not. It starts so much earlier.
Right, and that was just really fascinating
and just how
to
much
observe.
of our environment is constantly giving us these lessons that a lot of times are just completely false. And these ideas about what people will do, how they'll behave, what it matters, what's important, what will get you love, what won't, what will get you hate. Now, all of those things.
Yeah, I guess that at the base it comes back to, are you going to be supported by the group? Are you going to be an outcast? And that sort of level of survival as a gregarious group of animals that we are as primates.
Basically being cast out as a gregarious animal is a death sentence. Yeah. When you are, and that's why it's so important to all of us. So yeah, that's one of the most direct drives,
most painful thing to touch.
I mean, prison is
most sensitive.
Is not about torturing people. It's really
isolation.
The biggest part is the isolation. That's why they put you in solitary confinement
as an extra punishment.
As the worst punishment is to keep you from socializing. Is that one of the most painful things you can do to a human being?
I mean, house arrest, prison, solitary confinement is just different levels of removing you from society that is good and beneficial and there for you and loves you.
Yeah, the society that does.
Right. Yeah, removing you from a society that loves you, which is one of the primary mode of survival for gregarious animals. So going back to that quote, politics are extremely important. Getting people to like you is extremely important to our primate instinctual drives. Your survival is affected by people liking you, and so honesty and people liking you they're not always the same thing.
Yeah, no, they really don't. They don't go together very much.
Really don't.
Yeah, honesty, as a matter of fact, is one of the things that gets you really fucking hated.
So we frequently talk about politicians and the fact that if you are a politician, the point is to get everybody to like you, but that is sometimes fundamentally fucking possible because there's so many polarized ideas and
so
groups.
That's why they become liars. And a lot of times I think that they believe their own completely.
Well, they have to.
I think a lot of times a good politician, and I don't mean necessarily highest level, but a person who is at their
You mean
core,
good at being elected or good at being a policymaker?
No, I mean good at being elected.
Okay,
I mean,
so
being good at the popularity game. Let's say a politician in high school. You know, it's like they are a shattered mind in general because they cannot possibly satisfy a large group of people when all those various groups have very conflicting ideas and ideals. And that's why they end up becoming, they feel like they tell themselves, oh, I'm a chameleon, I can fit in any group. And the truth of the matter is they just have conflicting ideas about everything. They don't have one real certainty about how they should act, who they should be, what is real, what is true. None of those things. So their mind itself is holds on to and keeps all these mutual exclusivities. And so they actually become all these various people. They feel like, oh, I'm a chameleon, I can fit in any group. And that's just another one of those self-deceptions we're talking about. It's like, no, you just can't help but become whatever you're around because that's how you set up your mind.
Because you have drives deep inside you that your consciousness is blinding you to by making up excuses. Right. But your actual true drive is to be one with the group because there's valid reasons for that.
When they're kind of aware of the level of lying they do. But even those people a lot of times will not be aware of exactly how much they are lying to themselves and lying to people around them. Because, well, when you don't have any real opinion, are you actually lying? If you represent these completely opposite ideas from one moment to the next, but don't have any real solid opinion because
you partially don't have any stake in the ground, so you're just kind of open to everything.
Right. Well, not just open to everything. You actually believe multiple things that are completely in opposition.
But that's the story they tell themselves, that they are open to all ideas.
Right. They tell themselves they're open to it, but the truth of the matter is their mind is shattered. Right. It doesn't have any unity, and so they actually do believe these various things. So they're not really necessarily lying.
But for our audience to understand that we need to discuss the fact that if you, and once again we'll go back to that with Jordan Peterson, if you do not have certain hierarchies of meaning in your mind cannot function. That's one of the reasons why we talk about postmodernism as being as pernicious as it is. A lot of that has to do with disjointed ideas, which makes your brain not function all that great. Systems are terrible, but systems are necessary. I will forever quote Stoya on that one thing. She's absolutely right. Systems are terrible, but systems are necessary. And they're terrible because they keep things and people and ideas locked in that shouldn't necessarily be locked in, but they're also absolutely necessary. We have to have a hierarchy of meaning, a hierarchy of value, a hierarchy of importance in order to navigate the world.
I just had one of those paranoias that were like not broadcasting or anything like that. You can check. It's happened before. It's like, oh my god,
it absolutely has.
Going right. Okay.
Yeah, no, I've gotten pretty good at it. Okay. And I'm pretty sure we got volume. Yep, we got
okay,
sound.
Good. We're not muted. We're not
muted. We've been live for 30 minutes. We got viewers. We're good. But that's good that it would have, if it was wrong, it would have only been 30 minutes in instead of an hour or two.
So. Okay, good.
No, I traumatized you pretty bad with that. Nearly 2 hour.
Just, oh my god.
So
you want to talk about the methods on this this particular 10-second thing? So
absolutely. Yeah,
because I felt like that was an important sort of digression when we talk about all of those various things.
And then we'll circle back around to
eventually I want to get to like collective unconscious and
oh, absolutely. I would love that, because that's essentially what the culmination of the show will be with the patron after chat, is the Jordan Peterson, Terence McKenna complexity of meaning. Duet.
Yeah, and it's funny, we've actually hit on something I was writing today in in my group. And it was just a talking about the having completely unstructured association as part of a mental framework, where it's just, this is associated with that, this is associated with that, and there's no overarching system of constraining those associations in any shape, form, or fashion. And because there is no constraining structure, there is no way to predict a new association. You understand what I mean? It's kind of hard to explain, but it's like if you have a bunch of let's say we have a bunch of like knobs sticking out of a surface that you could wrap a string around. If you can just wrap strings around in all of these various different ways, then you couldn't navigate through the knobs in any way, right? But so it's not like a tree. It's like just a big old tangled mess. But then there is, when you have something like a tree grows in a way that has a sort of hierarchy to it. In other words, there are associations from leaf to small stem to larger stem to the trunk. And so there are all these ways in which there are associations, but there is a constraining structure to the association. And so I think that in human minds there is. And
what is the constraining structure other than language?
Yeah, well, one of them is language, but the other is we're going to talk about meaning.
True.
And so how it is.
But language is, they're both.
So it's like how you predict.
It's two sides of the same coin.
How you predict the future is based upon some. It's basically like when you think about what's going to, what direction are new leaves going to grow, or new branches going to go? Well, they're going to be constrained by the previous branches. Whereas if you just have a big mixed up pile of growing vines going in all different directions in a tangled mess, there is no ability to predict anything that's going to happen to that tangled mess in any way. And so that is that ability for prediction that comes from what we think of as intellect, as real, useful, innovative intellect, comes from the structure and the constraining of the structure. But it also requires that the right connections. In other words, it requires that associative part of a tree of knowledge that we're constantly growing. But the fact that it has a constraining structure over the top of it, as part of I can't explain it any other way, but that leads to prediction. And so that's the whole point of where. That I think that we have both a completely unconstrained associative framework that we can have in our minds that is kind of necessary for exploring the absolute unknown, but and I think that animals have lack a level of structure that humans have gained in the development of consciousness. In other words, what we think of as consciousness, it is that associative structure. So anyhow.
I would even say that as you skipped past so many points that I want each one. I was like, stop now. I want to talk about like every one of those.
I know. Well, it links to so many things, but I
right, exactly.
Say something extremely complex in the most concise possible terms.
Oh boy, that's not an easy feat. But it's really fascinating that you talk about that both prediction as well as constrained by structure, because I believe that language and meaning are two sides of the same coin, and that we are constrained by the structure of our brains, which has evolved past animal brains. And how has it evolved in the most important way? Language. And so there's this really interesting thing about neuroscience where
excellent point.
And I found that as well here, where when you think of a certain word, your brain can't help but think of all the other words that are associated with it. So we're talking about association based on language, but then it gets filtered in terms of meaning. And so there's this really great study, and we're going to talk about this later.
Oh my God. And let me also tell you that this relates to the idea of the collective unconscious from Jung, specifically because he what he's talking about is the way that there are these stories and things in instinct, and how that relates to language is that now with the ability of Carnegie Mellon University to be able to pick out not just words but phrases and complex phrases, etc., from the brain, shows that there is a existing set of symbols and structures in the brain.
They're interrelated.
That all these various humans have, which is the basic idea behind the collective unconscious, is these pre-programmed structures of meaning in the brain, that are genetically put there. Interesting.
But as we're talking about tracking the semantic threads, here's a quote from one of the researchers, and we'll talk about the study later, the set of studies, and this is Princeton. They're talking about someone will start thinking of a chair, and then their mind wanders to the chair of a corporation, then to Chairman Mao, and you'd be surprised. End quote. So, it goes from just the actual chair, then to a chair of a board of directors, then to Chairman Mao. And so they, the associative threads, semantic threads.
The giant, the hugeness of the leaps that can occur that's what makes it so difficult to really, with any, reliability, predict what somebody's thinking.
But it's still compelling that it's...
But there is a probability density. That's the kind of the point, is that there is in other words, it's still associated in a certain way. There is a way in which you can go from one to the other, and it's not just completely from magic. It's not ex nihilo. It's not coming from nowhere. There are prior things that build up thoughts.
And that's exactly my point. Thank you. That basically non sequiturs, or not Freudian slips, because I feel like Freudian slips are a little silly for the most part. But in terms of like non sequiturs, when you're talking about one topic and then a person will come up with will say something that just seems like to completely not go with it whatsoever, and they themselves feel like it doesn't go with them. Well, that's really not true, as we can tell through neuroscience, that there are associations that have been lit up in their brain, these semantic threads that their brains have followed without their consciousness keeping up with it. And then they presented it, and then their brain's like, oh shit, why did I say that? Oh, well, I can't find any reason, because all that's buried deep in the subconscious. So I guess it must be for no reason, definitely a lot of really good stuff. I want to talk about all of it all at once.
Okay, let's get to the study.
Okay, one by one. All right, so how did they do this, the study in particular with the 10-second thing? Well, Haynes and his colleagues imaged brains of 14 volunteers who were performing decision-making tasks. The volunteers were asked to press one of the two buttons whenever they felt the urge to. Each button was operated by a different hand. At the same time, a stream of letters was presented on screen at half-second intervals, and the volunteers had to remember which letter was showing when they decided to press their button. When the researchers analyzed the data, the earliest signal the team could pick up started 7 seconds before the volunteers reported having made their decision. Because of the delay of a few seconds in the imaging, that means that the brain activity could have begun as much as 10 seconds before the conscious decision. The signal came from a region called the frontopolar cortex at the front of the brain, immediately behind the forehead. This area may well be the brain's region where decisions are initiated, says Haynes, who reports the results online in Nature Neuroscience. The next step is to speed up the data analysis to allow the team to predict people's choices as the brains are making them. So essentially, that's what the letters are for. I think they're just tracking the time. But yeah, they told them randomly press a button whenever you feel like it, and then just tell us what button was on the screen. And what letter? I actually, honestly, I don't really understand the letter part. Like, why does that for?
It's just to give a marker. They have to keep changing it so that they have to have something that's different each time. It's something that and it has to be a familiar system. So you use letters, and that way they can sit there and keep giving letters in a sequence, and then whenever a person
it's true. I forget. It's been really quite a while since I've studied specifically psychology, because it was my two first years of college. The latter of three were neuroscience. But yeah, I forget that in psychology experiments, you have to lie to people in a way. You have to add things. You can't just test one thing, because then they'll know what you're testing. So you always have to add some other things. So a lot of times whenever you're looking for attention testing or testing of something else, you're telling people that I'm testing your memorization. Well, you're testing their bias or something. And so you always have to tell them or give another stimulus for them to sort of distract from the real.
Right. There's some level of creating controls and trying to eliminate bias that you always have to include.
And so that you get the most honest results possible. But the results are built on some well-known work on free will done in the 80s by late neuropsychologist Benjamin Libet, then at the University of California, San Francisco. Libet used a similar experiment set up to Hayes, but with just one button and measuring electrical activity, so not MRIs, in the subject's brains. He found that the regions responsible for movement reacted a few hundred milliseconds before a conscious decision was made. So even back in the 80s, we had evidence that the muscles already had the signal to move before you knew it in your mind.
Mm-hmm. I remember that. Yeah.
But Libet's study has been criticized in intervening decades for its methods of measuring time, and because the brain response might merely have been a general preparation for movement rather than activity relating to a specific decision, because it's kind of hard to know just through electrical activity that they
carried out this.
Yeah, exactly. Haynes and his team improved the method by asking people to choose between two alternatives, left and right. Because moving the left and right hands generates distinct brain signals, the researchers could show the activity genuinely reflected one of these two decisions. But the experiment could limit how free people's choices really were, says Chris Firth, who studied consciousness and higher brain functions at University College London. Although subjects are free to choose when and which button to press, the experimental setup restricts them to only these actions and nothing more. He says the subjects hand over their freedom to the experimenter when they agree to enter the scanner. So essentially, they're not free, really, to do anything other than left or right. So the freedom is limited to two choices.
Yeah,
which
that's
I'm not sure.
Reality.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the point of that is.
I'd like to exist in England right now. It's like I don't have that freedom to do so. It's there's a lot.
I guess that the point is, what does that mean for the nebulous concept of free will?
Yeah. Free will is an absurdity when taken. You have to understand free will is within limitations at all times, and so therefore, when you start to recognize it's within limitations and you start looking very closely at those limitations, the limitations start to grow and grow and grow until you recognize that a lot of it is not nearly as free as we would like to believe.
Yeah, if choices really are being made several seconds ahead of awareness, quote, there's not much space for free will to operate, Haynes says. But results aren't enough to convince Frith that free will is an illusion. Quote, we already know our decisions can be unconsciously primed, he says. The brain activity could be part of this priming as opposed to the decision process, he adds. Part of the problem is defining what we mean by free will. But results...
Yeah, and so you take these results with things like unconscious priming that he's talking about.
Yeah, because neuroscience will alter what we mean by free will. Because if we have evidence like this, we have to adjust our meaning of what...
Yeah, and not just that, our colloquial ideas of free will are absurd. Just the kinds of you go out on the farm and and talk to people. Their idea of free will is just it's not going to be anything remotely similar to what's real. It's just they're going to have these completely absurd ideas of it. So yeah, there's but the point is in neuroscience you look at things from a wide variety of angles, like these studies of unconscious priming, which I wish we could talk about some of the unconscious priming things. But I mean, I guess there's
I have something.
Okay, good. Let's do that.
So I'm torn whether I should talk about the constraints of structure of brain and language that allows neuroscientists to predict what words people will use, because we definitely have that.
We can get back to that.
Right. Okay. Cool. All right. Approximately a decade ago, and this was written in 2017. So yeah, very recent. Approximately a decade ago, academic circles were set abuzz by a set of studies that had produced some curious findings. The experiments went like this. A group of college students with nothing better to do and eager to earn a little beer money were split into two groups. Each participant was asked to select the better of two apartments or automobiles or some other common consumer product. Although one man's palace can be another's prison, the studies were designed such that one of the two options would be objectively superior. That way, there would always be a right answer. Both groups of students were given the same information to consider before making their decisions, although some were given data about a greater number of attributes so that the researchers could distinguish between simple and complex decision making. As it turns out, at least in some cases, the students made better decisions, that is, more frequently selected the superior item, if, before making their choice, they were subjected to a period of what is known as deliberation without attention. Basically, if the students were made to solve anagrams or word search puzzles for a few minutes, also known as meditation, instead of thinking about the problem that they had been assigned, the quality of their decision-making improved. What's more, the effect seemed to become more pronounced as the complexity of the scenario increased. So TLDR, if you let your subconscious stew on something, it'll do a better job than your conscious of making the right decision.
In other words, you've got background processing that's actually occurring.
Yeah.
In other words, your brain is not just doing what it's doing right at this moment. It's doing other shit too. You're thinking out problems.
And you don't necessarily know it.
No, you're completely unaware of background
You may
processing.
feel like you're zoning out or something. You feel like, like you're something, but... Yeah.
But we stew on things. We have background processing occurring at all times.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this conclusion stands in stark contrast to what we think we know about thinking and problem solving. Intuitively sophisticated problem solving requires deliberacy, consciously considering the problem before even rendering a conclusion. This wisdom is tied up in the aphorisms, those stories we tell ourselves about what we think and why we think it. Aphorisms that include aphorisms that we inculcate in young physicians. Think before you act. Don't just do something. Stand there. Love that.
Yeah.
Haste makes mistakes, etc. Still, doctors immediately took note, and rightfully so. We're constantly making complex decisions under conditions of risk and uncertainty, and in our world, the consequences of a bad decision are a lot more severe than getting stuck with a card that's a lemon for a few years. If we could improve decisions simply by replacing conscious deliberation with a brief period of distraction, it would represent a great and essentially costless step forward for us and, of course, the patients of these doctors.
And also, it's a great study to talk about whenever your boss gives you shit about browsing online when you theoretically should be working. I am working. It's just a background process.
Exactly. Love it. So alas, when things appear too good to be true, they usually are. Contrary to our hopes and dreams, the value of deliberation without attention has failed to be validated in anything resembling a clinical environment. In fact, substantial questions have been raised about the existence of this effect in any context. A comprehensive meta-analysis, for instance, found that although a number of the supporting studies did demonstrate an effect in the hypothesized direction, they also very often failed to reach the level of statistical significance. The same meta-analysis also concluded that conscious thinkers were more successful at both identifying the top choice and distinguishing between more mediocre options. Studies that have found focused exclusively on clinical context have some similar conclusions. The takeaway is that there's no reason to believe that practicing physicians, and this is a very specified article, practicing physicians would benefit from distracting themselves with irrelevant tasks before making patient-centered decisions. Too bad. I guess I should have rushed out and bought some enormous book of word search puzzles.
Damn.
Yeah. When I was going over these studies, one with this article author, one particular finding jumped out. In one experiment, the participants were divided into expert and novice groups, and each group was given either simple or complex medical problems to solve. As I'm sure you guessed, deliberation without attention was mostly found to be useless. But there was at least one exclusion. When novice doctors, medical students actually, tackled simple problems, it seemed that compared with making an immediate judgment, taking a few minutes to complete some irrelevant and mental exercise improved the outcome substantially. So so it seems to be something that benefits those who don't have experience. So in lieu of hard daily years of experience, background subconscious processes do a little better than using your
So
conscious
basically, the
brain.
idea is that when there is an achievable right answer that one can use very specific information for, then the more conscious process it seems to win out. But when there is not necessarily information available to you and you have to come up with a new solution, then basically it seems like what they're exposing is that something that requires more creative process, which is what's necessary for a novice.
Exactly, because their foundation of knowledge is poorly,
right,
structured.
They end up
poorly developed,
coming to better conclusions in that way.
Yeah. And of course, something else that the study suggests about the various modern initiatives, such as night float regulations and 80-hour work weeks, and this is something that they do for doctors, that have sought to draw a bright line between work and personal time. These ideas are rooted in our contemporary understanding of the importance of self-care, as well as acknowledgement that lifestyle considerations can often dissuade talented people from pursuing demanding specialties. So back to the boss thing, if it's a new project that requires creativity and you're stuck, and you do some Sudoku or browse, or do some online gaming or something, browser gaming, and your boss comes down on you for it, you can point to the study.
I'm a bit the cliche. I'm being creative. I'm exercising my creativity. May actually have some foundation in reality.
Exactly, and then of course they end this article with talking about.
Though apparently, if you're doing an experienced something that requires experienced decision making, you just can't use that excuse. It just doesn't work.
It really doesn't. And of course, the article ends with, I do have an idea. Why don't we all take some time and sleep on it? Now that actually has back to our spotlight.
It's a fun article, but it doesn't. I was hoping you would talk about something that has to do with priming. Oh. Yeah, in other words, unconscious priming, where basically you can see the outcomes of decisions simply by the context in which they. In other words, you can alter people's decision-making process simply by altering the context in which you give them biases that they think that you haven't given them. They're not aware that you've given them, and there's just so many different ways in which they've shown that in neuroscience studies.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure why I pulled this up, because a lot of times I pull down studies and collate them into a specific topic, and then I go back to them later.
Well, it was fun. I mean, just
basically
that
there are background processes,
and that in some cases background processing is not as useful as in others, and that totally makes sense. But it's a neat little thing. But no, I was hoping you'd get more into the unconscious stuff.
Well, we do definitely have the unconscious stuff in terms of scientists being able to create an atlas of the brain in terms of what people are thinking and how the words are organized.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that.
Yeah, and this is actually it's reported by The Guardian of all places.
Is this from Carnegie Mellon as well?
This one in particular, there was a Princeton one that I will talk about later, but let's see. It's hard for me to find who they're.
You can, if you want to look into the one, you can look up Beyond Bananas, and just that term alone will come up with the article about the mind reading stuff at Carnegie Mellon, which what they're doing that's the only way to describe it. It's fucking beyond bananas.
You mean beyond melons?
Yeah, it's fucking crazy.
But I don't know if this is the Carnegie Mellon ones or other ones. We'll probably figure it out. It might be UC Berkeley. But scientists have created an atlas of the brain that reveals how meanings of words are arranged across different regions of the organ.
Okay.
Like a colorful quilt laid over the cortex, the atlas displays a rainbow in rainbow hues how individual words and the concepts they convey can be grouped together in clumps of white matter. Quote, our goal was to build a giant atlas that shows how one specific aspect of language is represented in the brain, in this case semantics, or the meanings of words, said Jack Gallant, a neuroscientist at University of California, Berkeley. No single
Gallant, yeah, okay, Gallant. I just posted a link to Gallant's work showing how they are able to. Gallant was one of the first to pull images out of the brain. In other words, like
to basically record our dreams.
Yeah, well, no, not the recording the dreams. I think that was still Carnegie Mellon. But he had some of the first, images pulled from the brain where you could see, here's an image of a flying parrot, and here's an image that he pulled out of the brain. You can make out the general. I mean, it wasn't
like
very
our
clear
mind's
image.
eye kind of thing, or
the actual image in the brain, because it was somebody had brought up an article about.
I don't understand. Is it the visual cortex? Is it imagining
almost
it?
Certainly, it's almost certainly the representational of basically the activation of certain neurons in the brain.
So like think of a parrot, and they could actually.
This is actually them visually seeing it. So it was.
Okay.
Yeah. It was. I mean, and one of the things I related is like, that's kind of because the visual cortex is so orderly. It's
literally a 360 grid, it's 1-to-1.
It doesn't compare to the Carnegie Mellon work, but
it's still compelling.
But it's still neat to show. It's like, no, here's an actual representation of a parrot. This is the data pulled from the brain,
from the meat.
Somebody, this is what we pulled from a brain, just looking at the brain while that person was looking at an image,
right?
And you can see the correlation of the data very directly.
Yeah, so the brain is very directly your mind.
I mean, obviously, but so many people want to think we're magic on the inside. So
our brains only look like everybody else's brains. Like all the other animals' brains. We're completely different from them, even though all of our hardware is exactly the same.
Yes.
Well, we definitely have more developed language, that's for sure. Or do we? Because if you think about birds, birds have quite a range of vocalizations.
Well, but
as well.
But you're talking about when you start bringing in birds actually have a crazy level of intelligence.
Yeah, birds are particularly special.
Animals.
Yeah.
So that's not fair.
Yeah, I know. I know. So essentially, this study of the atlas, or not the findings, but the generation of this atlas.
This is Gallant's work. Interesting. I wonder if there's any coordination between Carnegie Mellon and Berkeley on this.
So what we're finding is that no single brain region holds one word or concept. A single brain spot is associated with a number of related words, and each single word lights up many different brain spots. Together, they make up networks that represent the meanings of each word we use: life and death, life and love, death and taxes, clouds, Florida, and bra. All light up their own networks. And back to, or forward to, semantic threads. Essentially what I was talking about is that you give a person one word, and that sets off an entire network, lights up a chain reaction of things that are associated with it through the meaning of that word, because you can say
by the way, what we're talking about is sort of semiotics, just so you know.
I mean, we don't. When do we not talk about semiotics?
Biosemiotics.
When are we not talking about that? That's like if you were to condense our study of of interest, the like everything that we research. At the end, both you and I come down to biosemiotics as sort of the root of that connects.
And that's the name of one of the groups that I'm in. Okay, so.
But yeah, like what would be a good example of I don't know if you're British, let's say the word bird. Bird can mean a woman, or it can mean an actual bird. So meaning is integral in this process. Not only is language itself important, but
the interconnection of various concepts, of course, is going to be.
Because then when you think about a bird, you think about a woman, you think about Marilyn Monroe. And it'll light up a whole different
It's going to be different
network.
between individuals, but there are some basic concepts that are, and so it's basically it's the reassociation of some universal based concepts that make individuals more individual.
And of course, we have that really great TED Talk that is shared somewhere in our Discord server. So definitely check out the Discord server. It is free for everyone to join. There are special secret room for patrons, but for the most part, it's essentially a chat forum, as well as mostly a newsletter from me to you. And one of the things I published a while back was a TED Talk about language, where there's a group, an Aboriginal group in either Africa or Australia, that has directions east, west, south, and north as part of their daily language. They don't talk about on the right or on the left. They talk about north or south. Like the directions of the compass are integral to a variety of their interactions and language modalities. I don't know. And it was found that those particular people actually orient themselves in space way fucking better than Westerners. Like, they actually know where east, west, north, and south is way better than Westerners, because it's part of their language. So there's compelling evidence that the language you speak and how it's structured, what the hierarchy of meaning, and the choices of
and the
words,
natural associations that come from them.
As you were talking about in the beginning, the natural associations actually do change your cognition and your consciousness. So back to the atlas of words, described as tour de force by one researcher who was not involved in the study. The atlas demonstrates how modern imaging can transform our knowledge of how the brain performs some of its most important tasks. It's possible that this approach could be used to decode information about what word a person is hearing, reading, or possibly even thinking. One potential use would be a language decoder that would allow people silenced by motor neuron disease or locked-in syndrome to speak through a computer. To create an atlas, the scientists recorded people's brain activity while they listened to stories read on the Moth Radio Hour, a U.S. radio show. They then matched the transcripts of the stories with the brain activity data to show how groups of related words triggered neural responses in 50,000 to 80,000 pea-sized spots all over the cerebral cortex. That's a lot of thousands. Huth, the researcher Huth, Huth, Huth used stories from the Moth Radio Hour because they are short and compelling. The more enthralling the stories, the more confident the scientists could be that the people being scanned were focusing on the words and not drifting off. 7 people listened to 2 hours of stories each. Per person, that amounts to hearing roughly 25,000 words and more than 3,000 different words as they lay in the scanner. The atlas shows how words and related terms exercise the same regions of the brain. For example, the left-hand side of the brain, above the ear, is one of the tiny regions that represents the word victim.
Interesting.
Isn't that the morale?
No, that's the
right side. Interesting.
Right, temporal parietal junction. Yeah.
Neat. So the left temporal parietal junction houses the word victim specifically. The same region responds to killer, convicted, murdered, and confessed. On the brain's right-hand side, near the top of the head, is one of the brain spots activated by terms wife, husband, children, parents. Each word is represented by more than one spot because words tend to have several meanings. One part of the brain, for example, reliably responds to the word top, along with other words that describe clothing. But the word top activates many other regions. One of them responds to numbers and measurements, another to buildings and places. The scientists have created an interactive website. Hell yes, they have. That's exciting. Where the public can explore the Brain Atlas, and I will so be including that in the Patreon post. You better believe it. Strikingly, the Brain Atlases were similar for all the participants, suggesting that brain organized the meaning of words in the same way. The scientists only scanned 5 men and 2 women, however. Oof, that's a small sample size.
No, yeah, that's not. Well, I mean, what they did is it's a small number of people, but a huge number of words, and so
massive number of words.
Right, and so it may be a small number of people. So the correlation between humans, they have not very.
Strongly proven that it's similar for all the people, but they've definitely proven.
But I mean, when you have 5 different people, you should have
7.
7 different people.
2 women, 5 men.
Okay. Yeah, if you have 7 different people, then you should at least be if there isn't a commonality, that would show up. But instead,
the fact that there is,
that there is still a commonality there shows that there's at least a commonality between.
It's a good place to start looking.
that small sample. But no, we do need to go to the Carnegie Mellon site because it's very similar.
Send it to me if you don't mind.
Just Google Beyond Bananas.
It's too loud. It's
okay. Sure.
Yes, I gotta read.
All right, go ahead.
I gotta host the show. This part anyway, because I'm reading the rest of this article. It doesn't have much left, but Um, okay, scanned only 5 men and 2 women. However, they were all native English speakers, and the authors published the study in Nature. It is highly possible that people from different backgrounds and cultures will have different semantic brain atlases, and I believe that. I think that culture is shaped by language, and language shapes our brains. Therefore, there would be possibly big differences in brain atlases. But at the same time, as we were talking in the very beginning, the word right, as both your right to something as well as the directional right, are identical in Russian and English. And Cyrillic language and Germanic language, that's English, and Cyrillic, that is Russian, they don't share that many things in common whatsoever. So the fact that there is this weird commonality, and I'm sure there's others we can, if we were to explore, leads me to believe that there are universal human constants, but they will definitely be amended by specific language culture. Let's see, where did I leave off? Armed with the atlas, researchers can now piece together the brain networks that represent wildly different concepts, from numbers to murders and religion. Using the same haul of data, the group has begun work on new atlases that show how the brain holds information on other aspects of language, from phenomes,
Sure.
yeah, I don't know,
Phenomes. So
phenomes,
yes.
to syntax. A brain atlas for narrative structure has so far been
Phonemes is what you're saying. I know that sounded weird. Hey, it's like
phonemes. Yeah,
I'm like,
one.
what are you saying? That's weird. I don't. Yeah, okay, phonemes.
A brain atlas for narrative structure has thus far proved elusive, however. Every time we come up with a set of narrative features, they get told they aren't the right set of narrative. This is a quote from Galan. He says, every time we come up with a set of narrative features, we get told they aren't the right set of narrative features. I don't know what that means, but that's fine. Yuri Hasson, a neuroscientist at Princeton, and we'll talk more about Princeton and their semantic thread research, praised the work. Unlike many studies that look at brain activity when an isolated word or sentence is spoken, Galant's team has shed light on how the brain worked in a real-world scenario. The next step, he said, was to create a more comprehensive and precise human brain atlas. Ultimately, Hasson believes it will be possible to reconstruct the words a person is thinking from their brain activity. The ethical implications are enormous. One more benign use would see brain activity used to assess whether political messages have been effectively communicated to the public. There are so many implications, and we barely scratched the surface. Lorraine Tyler, a cognitive neuroscientist and the head of Center for Speech, Language, and the Brain at Cambridge University, said the research was tour de force in its scope and methods. But the Brain Atlas, in its current form, so this is the head of Center for Speech, Language, and Brain at Cambridge, said that this study was a tour de force, meaning she was fine with it having 7 people in it. So, I think we can give them a bit of slack on that. But the Brain Atlas in its current form does not capture the fine differences in word meanings. Take the word table. It can be a member of many different groups. It can be something to eat off of, something made out of wood, things that are heavy, things that have 4 legs, non-animate objects, and so on. This kind of detailed semantic information that enables words to be used flexibly is lost in the analysis. This is still Lorraine Tyler's quote. While this research is path-breaking in its scope, there's still a lot to learn about how semantics is represented in the brain. And that's definitely true. Words by themselves, of course, light up all of these different semantic threads, but where do these threads lead, and how are they connected, and how the brain picks the preferential thread is something, because as we know, the brain lights up with all the possibilities that a word might mean, but then it collapses down into one single meaning that you go with. So how does the brain do that? How does it pick the importance or the value of which one is the one that we're keeping and which ones are we getting rid of? So the understanding of semantics and meaning of things is definitely something we need to still look at.
How that is with that group, however.
And then there's a Princeton group as well.
Yeah, but the Carnegie Mellon group, I've sent you one of the links, and they were able to
you can discuss it. But yeah, it's good to have the link so I can share it with patrons, or the patron post. I mean.
Yeah, so they were getting between 70 and up to 94% accuracy of reading nouns from brains. I think almost a decade ago, maybe. I don't know. It was they were getting very good accuracy and being able to differentiate from different tools like the difference
This is a
between a hammer.
2017 study.
Okay, yeah, but that's the more recent one.
Okay.
I'm talking about what backs
I see.
that one up.
Gotcha.
And there's the difference between a screwdriver and a hammer. Oh, don't believe me. I was the one to you to read that. Okay, well,
because people have been listening to me for like an hour now.
all right, fine. I'll read it then.
Yay.
Okay, so. All right, Carnegie Mellon University, scientists can now use brain activation patterns to identify complex thoughts such as the witness shouted during the trial. Latest research, so this is building upon what I was just talking about, where they were able to identify nouns from the brain using fMRI with just amazing levels of accuracy. And why this is really important is just to show how much language being placed in a particular area in the brain means that there is a similarity between human brain structures that is obviously predetermined. You don't store the same information in the exact same place from one hard drive to the next, for instance, in computers. There is you storing the same information in the same place shows something that is very important that I wanted to talk about with the idea of collective unconscious and things of that nature, and how human beings may cooperate because of these shared structures in the brain. But anyhow, so going back to reading this. This latest research led by CMU's Marcel Just builds on the pioneering use of machine learning algorithms with brain imaging technology to mind read. The findings indicate that the mind's building blocks for constructing complex thoughts are formed by the brain's various subsystems and are not word-based. Published in Human Brain Mapping and funded by the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, IARPA, that's the brain arm of DARPA.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Oh yeah. No, there's definitely.
That sounds like.
Yeah, no, you should be scared, but
yeah. Cool. All right.
Yeah, no,
making sure I got that right.
Yeah, no, you should. The study offers new evidence that neural dimensions of concept representation are universal across people and languages. So, in other words, the concept, even though there is, there are differences in language. And there are differences in the associations. There's still a particular positioning of concepts. So, like for instance, there's something called the sensory homunculus in the brain, where from one human to the next, where we sense our feet versus where we sense our genitals. They actually happen to be right next to each other, which is one of the explanation for why people believe that there's foot fetishes so common, is because of the nearness of those sensory.
The penis and the feet are next to each other in the sensory homunculus, and
right.
Yeah, so
might
be some crossover
that
for
that's
some
the
people.
reason why that exists, because there's not a real good reason otherwise.
And some people are just a little too close to the point of overlapping.
Yeah, they just start overlapping, especially.
And
as you
so
get
whenever
older.
You see feet, your genital
right. Well, the
gets
thing
activated.
is, the brain as a brain matures, there's a lot more overlap of concepts. There's a lot more overlap because things reality isn't so finitely divided. That's not how reality works. But even though that is best for a child to have very fine divisions between everything, that's not
Borders.
That's not a complex brain. That's a very simple brain that we start with. But anyhow, so there already was the placement of the sensory homunculus we knew about, but now finding that concepts actually have, when it comes to nouns, what things are actually common between human beings. That's a big deal. So anyhow, yes. So IARPA is the ones who are doing this, and one thing I have to say about that is. It's inevitable that we will advance, because people always have the feeling, but man, we better not continue forward in that direction because it's going to be horrible. We're going to, period. So the question is whether or not you want it to be the knowledge and understanding of brain stuff to be concentrated in the hands of one tiny group of people, or do you want that information disseminated more widely so that we all understand how to defend against it as well. So yeah, I think it's important that that there's much more availability of this information, and knowing that how these things work is important to keeping the concentration of power from becoming a gigantic problem. But yeah, there will be abuses, absolutely. Let's just make sure to minimize those abuses by continuing forward instead of pretending to halt and therefore giving all the power to the few.
And of course, if we're talking about like the legal implications of being able to read a person's mind, does that mean you're reading their subconscious? Or are you reading the conscious that's making the excuses up? Like which one,
well, the mind reading thing here, you have to. It's still a long way off from very good mind reading.
Right.
It's just like a map.
But that's something that article mentioned.
Being
Legal
able to map that
implications.
there are locations for conceptual representation does not bring out the associative map. In other words, the associative map, how those concepts are linked together, are not revealed. By that map, it's simply a showing where where the concepts lie in the
and how
in the
they're
Berkeley model,
potentially related, but not.
Well, yeah, and how they may be potentially related.
But those are
in
just
the individual study, and that's the thing I think is going to be vastly different between individuals. But anyhow,
okay.
So going back to this, one of the big advances of the human brain. So this is reading the article again. One of the big advances of the human brain was the ability to combine individual concepts into complex thoughts, to think not just of bananas, but I like to eat bananas in everything with my friends, said Just. The D.O. Heb University professor of psychology in Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Scientists. We have finally developed a way to see thoughts of that complexity in the fMRI signal. The discovery of this correspondence between thoughts and brain activation patterns tells us what the thoughts are built of. So, in other words, we went beyond the technology I was talking about, where they had up to 90% accuracy in reading
individual words.
That was a basis for this IARPA research that is now leading to more complex things, like not just bananas, but I like to eat bananas in evening with my friends. I said everything earlier. Sorry about that. My vision is shit. Okay. I need to blow this up a little bit so I can read it better.
Don't blow it up. I mean, maybe just.
All right. Previous work by Just and his friend and his team. God, it's terrible. I haven't read out loud in a while. Showed that thoughts of familiar objects like bananas or hammers evoke activation patterns that invoke the neural systems that we use to deal with those objects. For example, how do you interact with a banana involves how you hold it and how you bite it and what it looks like. The new study demonstrates that the brain's coding of 240 complex events, sentences like the shouting during the trial scenario, uses an alphabet of 42 meaning components, or neurally plausible semantic features consisting of features like person, setting, size, social interaction, and physical action. Now you're moving things around there, okay. Each type of information is processed in a different brain system, which is how the brain also processes the information for objects. By measuring the activation in each brain system, the program can tell what types of thoughts are being contemplated. For 7 adult participants, so once again, back to that 7, the researchers used a computational model to assess how the brain activation patterns for 239 sentences corresponded to the neurally plausible semantic features that characterize each sentence. Is there some overlap between Carnegie Mellon and Berkeley? I gotta find that out. Can you look into that?
Sure.
Great. Okay, 239 sentences that correspond to neurally plausible semantic features that characterized each sentence. The program was able to decode the features of the 240th left out sentence. They went through, leaving out each of the 240 sentences in turn in what is called cross-validation. Ooh, that's sexy. The model was able to predict the features of the left out sentence with 87% accuracy despite never being exposed to its activation before.
There is a branch of Carnegie Mellon in Silicon Valley. That is the closest relation I've been able to find.
Interesting. I wonder if they like, is there some overlap? I bet there's some overlap between the work, because it sounds like.
Well, I have to do it based on the researchers rather than the.
Yeah. Oh, that would be Gallant, Jack Gallant. You can look him up. I think that's his name, Jack. Is it? It's Gallant, I know.
Yeah.
All right.
I think it's Jack.
Wow. So I was able to after using this process, was able to predict the features of the left out sentence with 87% accuracy. Wow. Okay. Our method overcomes the unfortunate property of fMRI to smear together the signals emanating from the brain events that occur close together in time, like the reading of two successive words in a sentence, I just said. This advance makes it possible for the first time to decode thoughts containing several concepts. That's what most human thoughts are composed of. He added a next step might be to decode the general type of topic a person is thinking about, such as geology or skateboarding. We're on the way to making a map of all the types of knowledge in the brain. CMU's Ying Wang and Vladimir L. Cherkassky also participated in the study. Discovering how the brain decodes complex thoughts is one of the many brain research breakthroughs to happen at Carnegie Mellon. CMU has created some of the first cognitive tutors, helped to develop the Jeopardy-winning Watson, founded a groundbreaking doctoral program in neural computation, and is the birthplace of artificial intelligence and cognitive psychology. Building on its strengths in biology, computer science, psychology, statistics, and engineering, CMU launched Brain Hub, an initiative that focuses on how the structure and activity of the brain gives rise to complex behaviors. So Brain Hub is another good link to add there.
Yeah, looking at the Gallant lab at UC Berkeley, Huth is involved a lot, Huth, but there's no overlap as far as
I'm sure they know
concerned.
a lot about each other's work.
They probably cite each other's work, but
yeah. So, but that's okay. So the point is here: why are we talking about this very close connection between various individuals and the patterns you can find in the brain that represent various thoughts? Well, that just means that there is a very close association of how human brains are made, and that there is a backdrop, a genetic backdrop that is already encoding a tremendous amount of information available. Now, some of the things, so we already know of instinct. Instinct is it's obvious that there are instincts, but where instincts lie, I just had a long conversation with a person who wanted to identify instincts as in a specific portion of the brain, and that's there are certain instincts that can be more localized.
Yeah, like fear for amygdala, but it feels like...
But instincts are encoded all the way to... Yeah. What exactly are instincts when you think about the fact that the way that the rods and cones are arranged in the eye determine what signals are sent to the brain. That the way that the eye developed is a system of memory that happened because of evolution. So there is we oversimplify where things are located when you have a system that is made up of a lot of different parts that all are cataloging and
we
reacting
kept
to information.
Adding meaning to our instincts. We kept reinterpreting our instincts, and that's how we've kept them with us. We see them as, a mother rearing its child is a beautiful thing, right? Like, we've added levels of meaning on top of it, so
but
you
can't
not
point,
have instincts go through all of the brain. Like,
but my point is that it's that instincts are encoded in a variety of ways, and just there is...
Seems like you can't have it any other way in a human.
The structure, just understanding that DNA is a memory, is a memory that is developed evolutionary by experience. In other words, a very long memory is what it is. Understanding that concept, I think, is kind of crucial to seeing how all of these things fit together. And why I'm bringing these things up is because we wanted to eventually. I mean, I think we kind of advertised this episode is about the noosphere and about collective unconscious, and that's kind of where I'm getting to is that Jung's idea that there are pre-existing concepts genetically encoded in the brain is now something that is very, very well supported. So now most people, whenever they think of the collective unconscious, I have to sort of differentiate whenever you say collective unconscious, a lot of times they're talking about a working system of I think it may be the most common way of thinking of it as like a hive mind, as like it in process, but that is not necessarily directly the first precepts of collective unconscious. The precepts, the underpinning of collective unconscious has to do with pre-existing information in individuals that comes from long and old genetic memory, and these are shared ideas that are constantly present in our minds at the unconscious level. And that was the initial impetus behind the idea of collective unconscious, which can then lead to hive mind sorts of thing, information that is out there by the collective action of human beings, and their collective actions and their collective thoughts leading to, just like the collective actions of neurons lead to larger concepts occurring in the brain, the collective actions of human beings leading to a larger type of brain. And that is the kind of idea that people most associate with collective unconscious. Whereas you have to look at Jung's initial idea being based on these things that we are just talking about. And so the other thing I think that is important here is also to talk about genetic memory. So instinct is obviously genetic memory. It's a type of genetic memory that's more generalized. However, in recent times we have to talk about how there was a proven that genetic memory can be far more short-term and far more specific. They've shown with mice that they can simply associate a fear response with what they did is, I think it was cherry blossom scent, and then up to like 2 or 3 generations later, ones that are completely naive, in other words, they have never experienced cherry blossom, will actually avoid the scent and basically there is an encoded fear response, which is directly a proof of genetic memory.
Also known as parental olfactory experience influences behavior and neural structure in subsequent generations.
Yes. So genetic memory has been proven now. And so we already obviously knew it existed.
Way back in 2014.
In instincts. We already knew that part of it. Not calling instincts genetic memory is a little silly to try to dissociate the two. I don't understand why you wouldn't think of that as genetic memory. But now we have even more short-term genetic memory, not just extremely long-term genetic memory. So just a single individual's experience can lead to subsequent generations having memories of that experience. Now that is something that is very new and very very interesting. But the point here is that, once again, to show that there is the ideas of the possibility of something that is like a noosphere is something that we now have a tremendous amount more hard data to use, and functional things of being able to mind read. In other words, real actual inventions that prove that these concepts of the commonality of storage of information between brains, which is that's what's happening when that is what's referred to in the Jungian ideas of archetypes and things like that. So now you have you have real workable information that proves that these things are true, and so that's kind of it takes it out of the realm of the more wooish feeling that people have. Whenever there are new concepts, people that rely on very complex associations, people tend to see it as wooish, and there's a lot of criticism of the idea of these Jungian concepts. But now, looking at it from this perspective, it's obvious that we have a lot of data that supports it. We have a lot of real workable, usable evidence that these things are actually true. So you were going to
oh no, I just it's just I'm trying to tie it all together with the fact that we have meaning, stories we tell ourselves, collective unconscious, all of that sort of together, and so that just kind of, it's a little off topic, but it's within the larger topic. So I'm not sure. We might have jumped the shark with the genetic memory, or not jumped shark. Got too early.
Freudian slip. No,
I don't know words.
Yeah.
But no, it's just something that I wanted to bring up at some point is the fact that people remember something that's told to them as a fiction more than something they remember as fact, and just in general storytelling and how compelling telling ourselves stories, because it's something that Chat was talking about as well, in terms of like going back to the question, if we were to look at a person's mind as they were thinking things, will we see what their actual subconscious thinks, the truth, or will we see the story that they tell themselves, in terms of like legal implications, using this in courts or whatever as like a different form of polygraph. And so there's just a really great 3 sets of studies in one paper. Talked about the experiment 1 demonstrated the extent, well, so they're talking about transportation, and it's a really strange fucking word, but it's defined as absorption into a story, such as imagery, focus, effect, and the scale of that sort of immersion in a story is something they were measuring. And they found that extent of immersion in a story augmented story consistent beliefs and favorable evaluation of the protagonist. Second experiment showed that highly immersed readers found fewer false notes in a story than those who weren't as immersed. And experiment 3 found, again, replicated the effect of the immersion on belief. And studies also showed that this immersion and the beliefs that it engendered are not generally affected by labeling the story as true or false. So the point being is that we are highly affected by a story and the conclusions we draw from it, and we don't give a fuck if it's real or not.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. That's, in other words, so that's just pointing out the influence that all of our various stories, like movies, and how much the writers
And
of
our
those
self-stories
are shaping society is something that the CIA and various different organizations have been shown to put massive amounts of money into Hollywood.
I believe it's been declassified that over 8,000 films have been TV shows have been directly. The approval and the setup for it and everything was passed by the CIA desk, and they did not exist without
because
their
they
approval.
understand that what happens to a society is very, very dependent upon the stories which it tells itself.
The culture changes based on those
just
stories.
like what the outcome of a single mind is very dependent upon the stories of which it tells itself.
Exactly. Very, very dependent, because we're talking about they don't notice false notes if they're immersed enough. Mm-hmm. So if they're emotionally involved enough, and I mean, I've been studying marketing from a specific copywriter,
Mm-hmm.
and the basis of marketing and how he does everything is he's there to tell you a story. Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting. I'm starting to read an interesting story, and then there's a sell at the end. Mm-hmm. Right in the middle, there's a subtly slipped in sell, but you're already so invested in the story that you don't realize that it's a fucking sell. Yeah. They're trying to push something to you because you're like, oh, he's just telling me that there's people who innovate, and there's an example of this one guy. Oh, look at this one guy being an example of innovation. No, it's his job to promote this guy. He is trying to make you buy things. And he's putting it.
Unfortunately, here's the thing.
And he straight up says that. Yeah. He says, "What have I taught you? Tell them a story."
Here's the thing that I have found that most where men and women often differentiate. I think men in general are more naive about the motivations of, first of all, themselves and of others in the stories that they tell. Mm-hmm. In other words, like I think men are less able to track that they are appealing to certain ideas and ideals and want others to believe those ideas and ideals when they're telling the story than women are about that whole process. I think in general the ideas of influence and all of those things seem to come more naturally, and they seem to be understood more readily by women than by men, because in my experience, guys are typically, oh no, they're just telling stories, you're just reading into it, they don't mean to tell. It's like bullshit. Okay, maybe they're not as aware of the story they're telling and the ideas that they're appealing to and representing to you. Maybe they weren't really aware of them, but they are still doing them. They are still setting up a structure of ideas that has to do with the belief about the way reality works, and they are conveying it to you in a powerful way that will alter your prediction, your probability, calculation of the way that you believe reality works. It is an extremely influential set of circumstances that in general, like I said, anytime I've talked to guys lots of times, it's just for entertainment. Why are you reading into it so much? Well,
I feel like women don't really do
I think
any
women
better than that.
I think they do in general. It's like you go all
At
the way
least they don't
back to
publicly say
like how
that.
much people hated Tipper Gore, for instance. Part of the reason why Tipper Gore was and there is going too
the
far.
whole Sarkeesian thing.
Right.
I see.
Right. There is a level of paranoia as well that you can read into it too far,
That the things that you
believe that
consume
everything is
affect you.
conscious,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that everything is a conscious manipulation, and when that is not true, that everything is not a conscious manipulation. There is a lot of it is completely innocent. So there is taking it too far, of course. But the point is that I think that in general, women tend to be more aware of the influential aspects
or at least be paranoid
of
about
language, and yeah, well, and it does being too aware of it does make you paranoid automatically. If you are too aware of that sort of thing, you will become paranoid.
And being generally sensitive to manipulation makes you more aware of manipulation.
Exactly. When you're more sensitive to and more aware of manipulation, it makes you more paranoid.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are things that it is a I believe it is a safer view of reality, a more stable view of reality to
do the guy way,
to kind of stupidly believe the best of everything and ignore the possibilities of the more sinister aspects of it to some extent or another. There is a balance there that I think is important, and I think that leads to a more stable mind, to be less aware of how much all of that manipulation is occurring. I believe that it's something we've developed for good reason. I think there is a mental stability aspect that is here's the thing. It is sometimes I've seen how there are strong personalities where they seem to be utterly oblivious of little cuts and little subtle comments about them, and it is the obliviousness that is powerful, because they are unaware of these little subtle cuts that people are trying to do in social circumstances and things like that. Because they remain oblivious, they end up powering through it and leading others in their self-confidence.
Right, because when those digs are subtle enough, you can't exactly call the person out on it because they're subtle, but when they're subtle, you can also ignore it.
Right.
And people will be like, well, maybe they didn't mean it like that. If the guy's not reacting to it hurtfully,
right. Whereas if you are reacting to it, then that gives it power. And so because there is some level of doubt that it instills, there's a lot of different things, and so there is a power to obliviousness that is extremely valuable. And I think that's why there are various mindsets that I think that are important to kind of be oblivious. And it's like the difference between courage and stupidity, though. I think that more adult minds, in other words, like
more complex minds,
you'll find they're usually a lot of older men, once they get to get beyond their 30s, are much more readily aware of all the subtle mental combat that's occurring around them.
They may not react to it or talk about it, but
then young men
but they feel it in their hearts.
Right. They're much more aware of all that kind of crap that's going on, and then there is a choice to ignore it.
Right.
And so it's just like somebody who's never been to war doesn't think that they can die rushing into battle is completely different than somebody who's taken a bullet before, watched their buddies die, and still go into battle. There's a
Why are you doing this to my feels?
There's a gigantic difference in courage, and so a lot of times there is a difficulty of people who actually do know all that kind of stuff that's going on and choose to still remain apparently oblivious, and choose to actually kind of be oblivious and to ignore all of that stuff that can bog you down.
So what was the I know you want to talk about the collective unconscious and meaning, and that's why we started going into the genetic memory side. So I'm not sure if I should talk about the psychology of meaning and hierarchy of complexity now, or just kind of throw it in for patrons to read because it relates to the Jordan Peterson video. Well, not patrons, but everybody.
What was it again?
It's a PDF from, there's a book called The Psychology of Meaning from 2013. And the first part of it is called The Architecture of Meaning. And it has Jordan Peterson's 3 forms of meaning and the management of complexity. And it's a couple of pages. But essentially, I wanted to know if we wanted to talk about complexity, as we kind of seem to have started onto it, and then just and meaning, and how that relates to the brain, and how does all of that link to genetic memory.
Okay, well, going back to complexity versus simplicity, there is something that you brought up earlier that was a good point. Yeah.
What's that?
That was the idea of whether or not they'll be able to read the specific, like, are you reading the lies that you tell yourself, or are you reading the
right? Are you reading the elephant or
the deeper truths?
Right.
And there is an aspect to the way that we put things together, the way that the brain puts things together in a more linguistic, linear sort of path. The voice in your head. There is a type of thought where it is that kind of voice in the head, talking linear sort of. It's not filmed. You can go ahead. There's this linear processing sort of thing that goes on in our heads when we sort of monologue. We have an inner monologue. And I don't think that is the more. I think that is more the liar and more the story we tell ourselves is more based on that voice in the head. And a lot of times we think of that as consciousness, whereas I believe that consciousness is much deeper than that, and that's just wakefulness. And furthermore, the important thing I think here to kind of point at is that there are a multiplicity of things that you're considering all at once. Anytime that you're considering a topic, you are considering millions of different experiences, millions of concepts simultaneously, and that it's impossible to compute them one at a time in the period of time that we do so. So there is when you're talking about the way that the human brain works, there is a type of computation occurring in the human brain that seems to be far superior to our normal computation methods that we look at in computers. And I think that is what I've been, basically touching on for a long time now, the difference between analog computation and digital computation. And it's the difference between linear and what a lot of times is referred to as like massively parallel. And what I mean by linear is in like stepwise, one thing, then the next versus simultaneous processes. And there is a level of processing that can occur with analog computation that is everything happening at once simultaneously, not like in math, you have to do things, you have to do this, then this, then this, then this. And the same thing with language. You think, this word, this word, this word, this word, and the ordering of the words is very important. But there is a type of computation where the ordering is not used, where the ordering is everything simultaneous. And this is something that is kind of coming out of our ideas of complexity, and something that goes all the way back to in computation. There's the halting problem where you end up having an infinite loop, and you can't break out of the loop because there's a lack of simultaneous computation that leads to noticing that it's an infinite loop beforehand. There is something called the problem of infinite regress that goes all the way back to the older philosophers, where anytime that you think about what the source of something is, what's the
analysis
cause?
paralysis, or
whenever you think of the cause of something, what is the cause? Well, the cause is this thing. Well, then is it this thing or the thing before it, or is it the thing before it? And you keep going, and you end up having the halting problem in the human brain, where you have an infinite loop exploring all of the possibilities, and eventually have to have some way to break out of the loop. And so how do you get a generalization of something that is such a wide set of data simultaneously? And it's a completely different computing regime that the human brain uses that has not been fully employed in computers. And once it is, what we're talking about here is the solution of the P versus NP. And
what's up?
That is something that I don't want to get into a lot of details on, but it's
polynomial
time versus
completely
non-polynomial. It is a question about how the speed at which things can be solved. It's kind of hard to.
That's fine.
Yeah. And the thing is, I have not done enough work to be familiar enough with the terminology surrounding the P versus NP problem to talk about it in a technical way. I can only talk about it in a more general way with confidence. So the issue, however, it has to do with something called this traveling salesman problem, and how it is that you find the most what's it called, the best route between places is not necessarily. I just recommend you look at. There's plenty of videos about the P versus NP problem, where they'll describe it a lot better than I can.
Yeah, I might have to.
In any kind of.
Because I don't know if I've ever
period.
heard that before.
It has to do with computation. And then there's also the
Explains why I haven't heard it before.
yeah, and then there's Gödel incompleteness, and that has to do with that there is a necessity of something kind of outside of a system. That there's always a way in which you can break a system. I like it as
Break the system?
oh man, I'm leading to Gödel, Escher, and Bach
Yeah.
here in the book because it's related because of the fact that I'm trying to point out that linear processing that happens in mathematics, linear processing that happens in language, all of these things have to do with something that is already. It relates to the ideas of quantum consciousness, and that is, and quantum consciousness not. I don't like that terminology specifically, but there is the multiplicity of overlapping meanings that are possible that do get collapsed to a single choice of many possibilities. And so that happens in the brain, that you have many things happening simultaneously that get collapsed to a more finite point that can then become linear processing. And so it is what happens before linear processing that the human brain is doing. And so
Right,
that
the
sort of
multitudes
thing,
of ideas that get
right,
lit up
all
before
of
it
those
collapses.
things that are happening simultaneously, those are not being accessed by these systems that we've been talking about. What we've talked about is language, specific concepts. It is the specificity itself that is there's a wide gulf between what they're doing right now, which has to do with lighting up specific linguistic concepts and the processing that occurs in the brain that has to do with thought, that is a more general analog combination of ideas. It's many various overlapping ideas simultaneously interacting with each other in a waveform. It is and that is yeah, exactly. It's far more complex, and so there's that is not being that. I don't think that it is a smooth or fast transition from what they're doing right now to real mind reading. That is, I mean, it is extremely useful what they're doing. I think it is, I mean, extremely powerful too. But it is not the same because there's a development in our computational methods that needs to that we need to go through. That is actually happening as well, and
what kind of development?
We're basically integrating analog and digital processing together.
Yeah, that thing.
It's
I've heard from you
analog,
15 years ago.
right, what you heard from me 15 years ago, they're finally doing right.
Well, okay, less than 15. We didn't know each other 15 years ago, but 10 years ago. All right, 10 years.
Yes. So
'Cause I remember I had the hardest time understanding what does analog mean. I asked you like a bunch of times, like, what does that mean?
Well, it's about simultaneous. It's massively parallel computing. It's simultaneous operations that are not, that our thoughts themselves, as we tend to think of our wakeful thoughts, are themselves stepwise. They go in a plotting, from first to last sort of a manner, and that just simply is not what's occurring when we think of unconscious processing. That is mixing of various tons of different sets of data overlapping with each other simultaneously, and being able to understand the concepts of data being overlapping is something that is kind of necessary for understanding emergence, and a lot of these things just get kind of to the heart of how reality works. That we're really at the very cusp of discovering all of these things simultaneously, and which is very good because we're also at the cusp of absolutely destroying ourselves, and if we don't completely and utterly revolutionize our understanding of reality, and thereby advance massively forward in technology, at a variety of scales and in a variety of ways, we're kind of doomed. So it's a good and bad thing that we're advancing so quickly in these technologies that are very scary, and you have these mind reading things that really are real, and people don't want to talk about it. I mean, I've brought up the stuff about Carnegie Mellon over and over and over and over, and people just I never hear anybody say anything about it, even when they're talking about very like they're very knowledgeable in neuroscience. They won't even talk about it. They just won't say a single word about it. I'd sit there and say, hey, look at all this stuff that happened with Carnegie Mellon. Look how they're continuing to advance forward. They're making real things that do stuff. In other words, these this is not some conceptual woo-woo that can't be proven. They're making devices that fucking do shit. Okay, they're making inventions. These things do things. They're not, it is a very reliable, completely proven system, and people still won't even talk about it. It's like it's too scary to even speak the words. It's like they feel like they're invoking the devil, by you say his name and it'll appear, and it's like you say the name of mind reading and it will appear, and it's like, no, sorry, it's still going to be there regardless of whether you stick your head in the sand and don't want to talk about it or not. It's real.
At least let's get as many eyes on it as possible.
The other problem is people want to believe in the magic in their head. They want to believe they're made up of magic, and sorry, you're not made up of magic. There's real mechanics going on that cause all of those things, every single thing that you think of as yourself. It gets really complex, and the borderlines start to mix, and then you have to consider levels that go beyond an individual brain and start to think about how your individual brain cooperates in a large scale network, and how that large scale network then also communicates back down to your brain. And so there's both top down and bottom up things occurring that make up you. And understanding the interplay of top down mechanics and bottom up mechanics, and how those two things happen simultaneously, really it's only through biology and through the complexities of biology that we have a good grasp of how those things work at all. I mean, it was just 50 years ago, the idea of having a system that can do both bottom up and top down simultaneously was just not really conceivable. But it's our understanding of how biology uses emergence to create extremely complex systems, and as we begin to understand that more, we begin to see how that relates to all of reality, how we have these emergence based systems all throughout reality, and how top down and bottom up simultaneously, and things like analog processing, all those things relate together, is just now starting to come to the fore, where lots of people are starting to get it.
Yeah, 10, 11 years ago, it was right when I was learning psychology and neuroscience, and it's funny you mention that, because we were told, well, here's how the brain does things. There's the bottom up, and then there's the top down. And these are the two separate systems that you... and these processes are top down, well, these other processes are bottom up. And so yeah, it was very, very distinctly separated. So I would think that they wouldn't necessarily believe that you could do both at once.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even governance itself, attempting it's my insistence that we'll only be able to create. I mean, that's what we're attempting to do with a democratic republic. The entire idea of our system of governance is to attempt to do both bottom down and bottom up and top down hierarchy simultaneously. A tangled hierarchy is the intention.
That's a terrible word. Tangled.
Yeah.
Like, that sounds like it's something undesirable.
Well, I'm using Hofstadter's terminology.
But that's unfortunate, because we need to relabel
I know,
it.
you're right. I need to find a better...
need to create a better...
I need to create better terminology around that. I agree. But for people who've read any of Hofstadter's work, that they would be familiar with that.
Yeah, for sure.
But so yeah, our attempt in governance has been to create that type of system that biology has already created, in the way that we're able to care for billions of cells, individuals that have their own needs of energy, they have their own output of garbage,
unique outputs, unique needs,
they have their own roles, they have all of these things, and we still care for billions of them with a very small loss comparative to the way that the rest of society is working. And they do determine, in other words, the way that cells form and what they do, it actually is determined by the cells. But I mean, it's determined by the cells in an emergent fashion, and is reliant upon their situation, reliant upon
DNA.
But that's just the way that it works out. And yeah, DNA, but DNA is both
variable.
Right, and it's dependent upon situation. It is
Yeah,
part of
because
that
it can
top down
unroll
versus
and roll up
bottom up.
areas that are not useful.
And it's just we really only understood top down control systems. We really that was for like I said, just the past 50 years. Really, the only thing humanity really grokked at all. The only thing that they really got was top down control. They just the very idea of the idea of bottom up control. We had a very general sort of, yeah, you have the people vote and then you do everything else top down. It's like it's there's a integration of the two that is only starting to we're only starting to really get through all of these various analogies being available to us through our better exploration of complex systems. And it's only through those analogies that we can really get a better understanding of how both top down and bottom up it can exist simultaneously.
So the genetic memory thing was on its way to collective unconscious, or
yes, absolutely. So genetic memory is just another way of showing that. So here you have genetic memory. You have these things that have to do with brain structure. Okay, so if you believe that the brain is storing any damn thing, then obviously it is doing so by its physical configuration. And so its physical configuration is determining where you keep all these various words, where you keep various concepts. In other words, and those things are preloaded. We have a hardware presets that have to do, just like a computer does with all of the various ways that a computer addresses the hardware, the way that it writes data. All of those things are information that's preloaded into not just the structure of the hardware of your computer system, but also in the operating system. All the way down, all the way up to the operating system, all the way down to the BIOS. There are all of these things that are loaded that are necessary for the higher functioning of the computer. And the same thing is true of the brain, that there are all of these preloaded underlying things that are part of genetic memory. They're part of and they determine what is possible. In other words, they are a constraining set of circumstances that determine certain certain outcomes. In other words, within a very, very wide range, there's a very wide range of things you can do with a computer, but there are limiting circumstances. You can't use a Windows computer to do some of the things that you can with Linux and others. I mean, there's ways to emulate, but it's not quite the same. And so, in other words, a server's hardware can be used to run one operating system or another. And you end up with very different results of how well they do certain tasks, and all of those things are related to the way that our brains are structured from going back to very ancient sources that are related to DNA. So there is things like behaviors, things like concepts. So the idea behind the collective unconscious is that we have these archetypes that are stories, that are ancient memory. Ancient memory of things that eventually it becomes very generalized. Of course, if you have these ancient memories of repeating things that occur in reality that have been captured by our genes. That's why we have these various stories that appeal to all humans, that we tell ourselves over and over, because they are reflections of a collective unconscious. Now Jung, I may have taken I feel like he definitely did take the deterministic top-down view of innovation too far. In other words, Jung tended to believe that all new innovations and discoveries of individual scientists were determined by the collective instead, and I believe that's wrong. I believe there is definitely, once again, a top-down and bottom-up sort of picture here. We have the collective unconscious having to do with all the associations of the underlying structures. Oh man, okay. I'm getting too far afield here without building up the. You want me to talk
pieces. About the
crossword
puzzle?
What I want to talk about,
or to give some.
No, not that direction. I want to go the other direction, which is more hard science, and that is cellular automata, or automata. How do you pronounce that? Who knows? Cellular automata or cellular automata are very simple systems that, when in combination with each other, end up creating complex behaviors. And if you have not looked into cellular automata, I recommend that you do so. It's very important conceptual framework to understanding how simple systems upon interacting can create complexity, and therefore you can understand how it is the simple, firing of neurons with each other, because of their, even though they have very simplistic methods upon which they work, those simplistic methods can end up creating very complex outcomes. And so understanding the complex outcomes of simple systems can relate you back to how it is that if you have all these human individual units that have memories that are all shared between them, that makes up a system that is like cellular automata. And that is, we create hive minds because of the shared data between the various individuals.
That doesn't seem like a strong. The crossword puzzle phenomena is way more hard science evidence of collective conscious than any of that.
No. What I'm talking about is
because that's assumption
that's
based
a
on
logic.
assumption based on an assumption. You
so
know how
what I'm
pedantic
providing
people
is
get.
yeah. Well, you have to do they're going to pick either one or the other. But there has to be a logical path that makes sense to how these things can occur.
True.
And you have to have a set of logic that leads from
right.
where there's no magic in the middle explanation. There are various hard ways in which you can see the outcomes there. But then there's also the evidence of collective unconscious. In other words, processing.
Research that points to evidence of it actually existing. Yeah, the crossword puzzle phenomena by Monica England is something that is usually brought up in that case, and it actually was put together by Richard Linklater in the 2001 film Waking Life, which is a great film, and it removed about half the fear of death from me. So I definitely recommend watching Waking Life. It has some soul medicine.
I don't know. I think it may be. It could be. I think
it could
it's
go either way, I
two-edged.
guess.
Yeah, I think it's a two-edged sword there.
Yeah, but in this was way back in the day.
Just because something makes you happy doesn't mean it makes you healthy.
Well, it didn't make me happy. It just removed dread.
Yeah. So there are some things that can help remove existential dread,
right,
but are not necessarily
for everyone necessarily.
Not necessarily good for long-term outcomes.
This was way back in 1991. It was an issue of Noetic Sciences Bulletin. Monica England published research on crossword puzzles. So she was a graduate, University of Nottingham, and it never made it into a more traditional journal because, of course, people were a little put off by the implications. And so what ended up happening is that she heard, there's folklore anyway in England, commonly heard folklore among people dedicated to solving the most difficult newspaper crossword puzzles. And some people believed that the crosswords would actually be easier in the evening or the next day after publication. So they decided to do research on that. They put people in isolation, and then they gave them crossword puzzles to solve. So let me give you the exact details of how they did it. Monica England studied crossword puzzles found in the February 15th, 1990 issue of the Evening Standard. So this was a year before the study was being done. England's experiments consisted of, so it's in England by a person named England. It's very confusing. England's experiments consisted of multiple test groups, which she studied both before and after these crossword puzzles were published. And of course, the groups were isolated. They had no way of getting these published puzzles. England also had each group complete a crossword puzzle from the issue of the Evening Standard that had been published 10 days before as her control. Ultimately, Monica England found that her test subjects had a 5% increase in their relative scores after the crossword puzzles were published in London. So
that is that's a p-value that is considered significant.
Yes. And Monica England's research on the crossword puzzle phenomena is clear argument for the existence of collective unconscious. What other reason could there be for this and other proven phenomena of mental connection between all human beings? With the 100 monkey effect, researchers saw a transmission of knowledge between colonies of monkeys on one island to colonies of monkeys on other islands. Furthermore, the hidden face experiment found that individuals had an easier time finding a face hidden within a picture after many other people had learned where the face was located. In this line of experiments, England's research on crossword puzzles clearly points to the existence of collective unconscious.
Okay, so here's the thing. Now, what I have a problem with what they're intimating here. They're intimating that there is, even though I do believe in electromagnetic communication between brains, I do not like where they're taking this specific where they're intimating what is the cause of these things, because it is not necessary to suppose electromagnetic communication between brains that is useful in this specific context of being able to solve crossword puzzles better. Because here's the thing, let's assume that it is that it's an effect that's been replicated, that it's that it is good science and not just problems in their results or whatever, and let's say that it actually is occurring, period. And in which case there are all of these things having to do with priming that we are aware of, where biases and priming and things like that can happen because of.
Well, Elizabeth Loftus did years of research on simply saying eyewitness testimony.
Right.
Yeah,
but the point
is
there are very subtle connections between concepts that you could be talking about what basically feels like a different subject matter, and because you are lighting up various concepts in a person's mind, because of the conversation, because of the communication between people, you can make a subject matter be more likely to be what a person is thinking about in a group. In other words, you'll find that there is a coordination between various individuals in groups that occurs because of the fact that they are all thinking about similarly related concepts, because concepts themselves have relations. And so simply because there is a lot of people who are thinking about a crossword puzzle and the associations between the various words and the things that they're attempting to do in the crossword puzzle, that information can be the associative information can be communicated through people communicating about other topics because of the trajectory of thought that it creates through the
semantic
priming.
threads.
Right, the semantic threads. But that is collective unconscious. That's what that is. That is a mechanism for collective.
So it's
unconscious.
like telepathy, but not really.
It's not. It is
a
person to person.
redefined telepathy.
Right. It is a person to person, actual, real communication that relies upon contextual.
That has negative space information.
Right. There's contextual cues that, because of the associative nature of the information, because it creates a context, it makes it more likely that context will then
survive, pass on.
Right. Will also be there in the minds of a person trying to solve a crossword puzzle. In other words, there is an increase of,
and those puzzles are pre-made each day by people who are making them, and they're selecting the words.
It's the probability. It is an increased probability of various concept sets created by the activity of those concept sets in a group, which also relies upon probabilities of concept sets to be their general, to direct their thought to some level or another.
The fact that there's a very rigid relation between things in a crossword puzzle. In other words, you have to have them fit with each other. That definitely limits.
And I'm all for
that's interesting.
the idea that minds can communicate with each other electromagnetically over far greater distances than people want to believe. And you have to look into how little. How sensitive sharks are, for instance, to electromagnetism. Biological sensitivity to electromagnetism is many, many orders of magnitude greater than people tend to generally believe or have experience with in any kind of designed object that we create. In other words, our ability to make sensors, our very best technological equipment, cannot differentiate or sense signals that biological technology has achieved. In other words, like in sharks in particular.
Not to mention the fascinating new research coming out from people being able to sense the vibe of a place based on whether there was tears or sweat or other neurochemicals or pheromones exposed in that area beforehand. So we actually have sensors that even we don't realize we have.
Oh, yeah, tons of sensors that are the fact that people are more attracted to someone who has the major histocompatibility complex that is most different from them, that's just huge. How much that we believe, I just decided I like this person, I was attracted to him. No, there are a million different things that were influencing your
some
decisions.
People will take it further and they'll be like, well, maybe when I was in my formative years, I saw a person who looked like that, and that's what. Nope, still not that. It goes even deeper than that. It goes even further
it's
than
all
that.
of, and that's the thing is, it's always all of those
Yeah.
things. We want to pick
Complexity, man. That's
We
our
want-
ultimate topic
right.
for patrons
we
anyway.
want to always pick that there was one source of something because that is a useful way
Yeah.
of doing things. You need to know what is the highest probability thing whenever you're building a view of reality that you want to be able to plan around. You want to be able to try to, man plans, God laughs is funny because of this specific problem, is that we do have to be able to plan, and so therefore we do have to oversimplify the causal chain of things. But that causal chain is an illusion. There are, we try to pick something that seems to be the largest contributor to what is causing a certain thing, but there are so many other things that are simultaneously causal in any given event. And so we need that illusion of that is the cause of things, but it's so many other things combined. So is there some interesting things in chat? I know you were keeping up with chat.
I'm just keeping up with chat.
Excellent.
Scrolling or skimming. That's the word. But no, I do. It's a tricky subject because, once again, like, how do you talk about hard science but then also make the logical leaps necessary to talk about future science in order to predict and envision and prepare for the future? And then you'll have that group of people who will always be like, well, you can't make that assumption. You can't, there's not enough.
Well, they can't make that assumption. That's the thing, is that because there are limitations. One can you when you limit your mind to more and more to try to be more perfect, that perfection itself eliminates the ability to recognize patterns. I mean, if you were to, pattern recognition is an exercise in error. I mean, you have to have a level of error to be able to pattern recognize anything. And so people who are very perfectionist about the way they're very fastidious about the methods by which they compose their knowledge and the way in which they allow any kind of leaps of association, they basically can limit themselves down to the point at which their minds become like a computer, where there is no ability to really predict per se. In other words, they lose. You can basically limit your mind to the point at which you're no longer really a human intellect. And lots of pedantic people tend to do that. And it's like, well, you can't say this, you can't say that, you can't. Yeah, that's true. You can't do it with any level of perfection. You can only, you have to have an acceptable level of error, of course. That's part of what makes human minds more powerful, is the fact that they can have an acceptable level of error. And that sometimes that level of error goes haywire. Absolutely, that is part of what makes a human intelligence superior to a computer intelligence. It is that ability to have a greater level of error that gives us a greater level of pattern recognition, and able to basically fit various things into the white space of the knowledge that we have. Because of course the knowledge that we have may be associated incorrectly. It may be missing vast swaths of data. There's all these things that are that are problematic.
It's fascinating you're talking about that specifically, because I have one last segue to go into a patron after show. However, looking on this Peterson's three forms of meaning, it's a fairly lengthy article, like 5-10 pages, just like a basic article. And I actually would like to do another article review like we did last time. Except this time I think we're going to agree with him, because I'd like to read just the first paragraph, and this will segue us perfectly into the Terence McKenna, Jordan Peterson video we have for patrons, and prime us for next week, where we'll discuss this entire article by Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
So this is from 2013, but it starts off with the complexity of the world. Most psychological models, even those as sophisticated as Gray, 1982, are based on the assumption that the world is made of objects, existing independently and given, or more abstractly, of stimuli. That assumption is incorrect. The boundaries between objects or stimuli are largely situation dependent and subjectively determined. Half our brain is devoted to vision. This indicates that we do not simply see what is there. The quote frame problem, unquote, encountered by AI engineers producing sensory systems for machines provides another indication of perception's complexity. This profound problem, the infinite search space for perceptual representation, looms over all other current psychological concerns. We live in a sea of complexity, and this is referenced to Peterson and Flanders 2002. I'm assuming it's his own other paper of his. We live in a sea of complexity. The boundaries of the objects we manipulate are not simply given by those objects. Every object or situation can be perceived in an infinite number of ways. And each action or event has an infinite number of potential consequences. Thus, as the robotics engineer Brooks points out, echoing Ezinek, perception is the essence of intelligence and the hard part of the problem being solved. The world does not present itself neatly like rows of tins on a shelf. Nature cannot be easily cut at her joints. We frame our objects by eradicating vast swaths of information intrinsically part of those objects and categories, but irrelevant to our current subjectively defined purposes. How do we manage this miracle of simplification? We will address this question from a neurodevelopmental and evolutionary perspective.
Yes, so the simplification is what we think of as wakeful consciousness, and it is a tiny, tiny picture of our actual consciousness. And it's what people tend to think of most frequently, but it's kind of a paltry, it's crap compared to what we are really going on the inside. That more analog process that's combining vast swaths of information simultaneously. That is basically dealing with overlapping multi-layered data.
Let's see if we have any particular chat that would like to cover. Let's see anything recently. Bilateral symmetry, blah, blah, blah. I wonder if decentralizing medical and veterinary treatment, home visits would produce radically better results because you wouldn't be bringing ill creatures into a concentration of pheromonal and electromagnetically communicated misery. Interesting point on that. I maybe not a specific answer to that, but there definitely is evidence of the fact that the clinical sterilized environment of hospitals is not good for humans, and not just for the sea of bacteria, etc., that is there, but a lot of it actually has to do with how white and hard and laminated and cemented everything is. In fact, there's compelling research to show that nature, just simply looking out a window at trees versus at a brick wall, speeds up recovery by 3 whole days. And of course there are things like touch and more because of safety and legality concerns and things like that, we are touching each other less and less and sterilizing relationships and items and making things boxed in and cemented and
oversimplifying them.
And we're paving over the unsanitary earth with deathly fucking metal.
Yes.
That
we're taking complex systems that are absolutely necessary, like even just down to egg washing. Egg washing itself makes eggs more dangerous.
I didn't even know that was a thing until last week.
Yeah.
Because I grew up in a place where, sometimes you're going to have some specks of poop on your egg, and then you break the shell, and no problem. You throw it away. You don't need it. Why would you ever need to wash an egg? What are you talking about? And I didn't even know that was a thing.
The internals of the egg are protected by coatings that are washed off, which is why it's illegal to wash eggs in other countries, even though we do it here. And so,
I had no idea that eggs were a cause of salmonella until I came to America.
This idea of monocultures, and people don't understand the dangers of, just having the right system, the biological system on your skin can change whether or not you have huge skin issues.
Biological systems in your stomach, like probiotics, can change.
And it's always the complexity and interaction of the varied systems that leads to a more robust solution. And understanding that robust solutions are far more complex is something.
And therefore difficult.
Right, and therefore difficult
and time consuming.
Difficult to create, difficult to balance,
difficult to manage.
Yes, and cannot be managed in a top-down fashion.
No,
those things are something that's really not been understood because of the short-term efficacy of simplicity. When it comes to short-term solutions, things that only work for a very short term and may actually cause massive damage on the long term.
And are sometimes necessary to immediately be,
right.
on it.
That we have started to master short-term things. As a matter of fact, the doctors that are the very best are trauma doctors. Those are the ones who actually know what the fuck they're doing, because they have to do something that has to do with immediacy. Now, the drugs that they use can be very damaging in the long term. You especially do not want to be exposed to a wide variety of those drugs over any long period of time. The things that they have to do, you certainly wouldn't want done frequently or over any long period of time. However, they are effective in the short term. So there are simplistic methodologies that are very direct, very top down. Those things have a massive amount of efficacy in the short term. And the thing is, if you do, but they also cause damage over the long term. So there's automatically a balance that you must be looking at, because those things that are effective in the short term are almost invariably damaging to the long term. And so being able to understand that is something that we're just now fucking coming to, because all of our various systems were based on short-term solutions that looked like they had massive benefits, but the massive benefits were short-term.
But the way you manage short-term and long-term are also wildly different, and we need both. And that's something that I've started to introduce in our conversations about left, right, up, down, man, women, like all of that. It's like, or specifically in terms of, do we conserve or do we liberate the funds or resources? Are we conservatives or are we liberal? Like that whole argument, it's like,
do you live in the moment or do you live for the future?
Exactly. And you need different strategies for both.
Right. And if you live entirely in the moment, you destroy the future. And if you live entirely in the future, you destroy the moment.
Yeah.
It's like
exactly.
There is a
you need top down and bottom up at the same time.
Right. And there's a cycling homeostasis that people think of as complexity, that nature has solved all of these very related problems. This understanding of complexity is something that is a solution that it's a commonality to a vast array of solutions to basically everything in reality. The complexity and this harmony of apparent opposites that have to do with the mutual exclusivity of short-term versus long-term, what's good for the group versus the group for the individual. All of those things are they're interdependent, and they're not actually as much mutually exclusive, but mutually dependent. And there is a tangled hierarchy between them that has to do with it has to be solved through simultaneous sorts of things. It has to be done through analog processing.
Yeah, I was gonna hold back the priming for our next show, but I'm thinking I'll just go ahead, since you said individual and group. I think I'll just go ahead and say it. I would like to discuss the Jordan Peterson article or whatever publication from the book next week, and then the week after that I'd like to go full controversy mode and go collectivism versus individualism.
Yes, because you need both.
You do need both, and I would like to talk about the benefits
and
of
one's
both.
more short-term and one's more long-term. And
there's benefits and drawbacks of both, and I definitely like to discuss that, because it's something that comes up a lot, where people have very specific definitions of both individualism and collectivism, and it correlates with their party line and things like that. And I would like to just add more nuance and
the attempt
research
in the attempt to say one is good and the other is bad,
right?
And because they want to believe one is good and the other is bad, when in fact both are good for different reasons, and both are bad for different reasons.
It's okay to have a personal preference. For instance, I have a personal preference towards collectivism, but not in the current world. Currently, I don't think there's a single fucking culture that I would want to be a collectivist with. Mostly, almost. Point is, collectivism relies on having a good culture that you can become a part of. But a lot of times, if the culture and the group is toxic, then you have to be an individual. So,
it is incumbent upon the individual to basically revolutionize,
disrupt a bad system,
which is destroy the collective system, if that system is itself destructive. However, it is incumbent upon the individual to cooperate with the larger system,
civilization,
and to be able to, if that system is functional and useful and valuable. And so there's there is not a universal good to being a rebel, and there's not a universal evil to being a conformist. They're both there's both a time and place where each of those is an evil and each of those is a good, dependent upon the contextual situation.
Yeah, and I'd like to bring neuroscience and psychology research into it to underscore our points and to provide this idea that you have to inject long-term and short-term into these considerations. You have to start thinking of, are we trying to fix it right now, or are we trying to create a system that will be functional 100 years from now? And also, but of course, it requires maintenance and other things and so forth and so on. But complexity is a thing. And we're going to hear about complexity from Terence McKenna and Jordan Peterson in just a couple of minutes with our patrons. So that's going to be a thing in just a minute. So I suppose, let me double check if we got anything. I'm not missing anything. Let's see if there's any chat points.
And even without saying the word noosphere, we've kind of been talking about all of the underlying mechanics for the noosphere concept.
My brother gave me some eggs from his chickens. His wife started to explain about the stuff on the eggshells. My brother was like, don't worry, he knows where eggs come from. The cloaca. Yep. Yeah, so I didn't even know that was a thing, that there was a coating that gets washed off, because like we've never washed eggs in Russia. But also another thing we did in Russia is when you're wanting a little breakfast of champions, you go to your fridge, take out an egg, pop open a little hole in it with your nail, and drink that motherfucker. I remember Americans looked at me like I was out of my mind when I did that. It's like, what are you why?
And in the context of industrial farming in the U.S., which
that would be insanely dangerous.
Egg washing, it is dangerous. It's just
they're right to look at me like I'm crazy
because you were in the context
of American agriculture.
Right, it's a bad
industrial
thing. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
However, in the context where you came from, it was not.
No. So yeah, context, complexities, meanings, it's a thing that we're going to keep talking about with our patrons in just a little bit by listening to Terence McKenna and Jordan Peterson. And then next Monday, we'll go over this 3 levels of meaning by Jordan Peterson. Hopefully I can throw his name up in the title, get some clickbait, views, some downvotes. So far, CherrySTEM has been not downvoted pretty much ever.
Nice.
So... I mean,
wait a minute. If they're not hating on us, then we're doing something wrong.
Right. Well, I mean, people listen for like 5 minutes and then they upvote. So I'm like, well, thanks. I mean, thanks for that. That's something. I would prefer you stay here the whole time and didn't give any votes, but I'll take what I can get. But yeah, so we'll.
Oh no, I want both.
Yeah, that's right. You want both. So yeah, we're going to be going over to Discord. So if you're a patron, join us in the Discord chat in the next couple of minutes. We will be ending the stream in just a moment.
Corporate accounts Nina speaking. Just a moment.
Yeah, let's get us some.
Oh, there was that associative memory thing and shared experience. I wonder how many people who I just lit up some concepts and memories and how many minds just now without ever saying exactly what I was referring to.
Definitely in mine. Well, I mean, that's what memes and references are all about, is lighting up concepts in each other's minds without saying a word about them. Because of those semantic threads, man, they're a real thing. Yeah. But we certainly like to think of them as existing in this case, but anytime it comes to any kind of existential anxiety or any kind of who are we, why are we here, are we animals, are we magic, they may not believe in those semantic threads as much when they don't want to, but that's the whole point, is that you have elephants in your brain. You're welcome to keep them there, but you'd probably have a more effective life and more effective way of reaching your goals if you didn't. So do what you will, but it probably is important to try to be radically honest with yourself. Yeah. So all right, we will see you guys next week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the stream and otherwise. And we shall see you next Monday. Love your faces.
Love your faces. I know, like, people, it's a new thing to, I wish we could, like, pop up his face on the screen as we said that, like dude did.
Yeah. We will see you all in a week. Have a good rest of your day, rest of your week.
Rest of your life.
Check out patreon.com/AnnaCherry for public uploads of all the previous 30 plus something episodes of CherrySTEM, and one of these days we'll be on the Spotify.
And keep a positive outlook. We gotta believe We got to believe in a future that we want, and we're going to make it happen. We're going to do this thing.
What dreams may come.
Yes.
Let us dream. Dreamers. See you next week.